In this lecture, we'll be looking at Antony, Octavian, and the formation of the Second Triumvirate. We'll begin by looking at Cicero's efforts to restore senatorial authority by supporting Octavian, and then turn to the siege at Mutina by Antony and Octavian's intervention, and then look at the circumstances that led to the creation of the Second Triumvirate, the battle at Philippi, and finally, the proscription of Cicero. So Cicero, who's pictured on the right-hand side of your slide, was desperately unhappy with Antony's efforts to position himself as Caesar's political heir in the aftermath of Caesar's assassination. He could see very easily that Antony was just going to become another Caesar, and Cicero wanted the Senate to fill that gap. In response to Antony's movements, Antony's grasp for power, Cicero left Rome. He left in early April 44, so very quickly after the assassination, but returned in late August. And he returned under the promise or the belief that Antony was going to restore senatorial authority. It had been reported to Cicero that this was going to happen, and Cicero had been at Brundisium about to depart for Greece, basically having given up on the restoration of the Republic, the restoration of senatorial authority, when word reached him that Antony was willing to play ball and that he would compromise and give the Senate back some of the power that it had had before Caesar took on all of the dictatorships. But as it happened, Antony did not follow through on these supposed promises. So Cicero returned to Rome in August, but nothing had changed. So Cicero responds, as Cicero is wont to do, by giving a series of speeches. And these speeches are very anti-Antony. They are full of invective against Antony. And it's a series of them that stretched through the fall and winter of 44, called the Philippics, as a collection. And in particular, the second Philippic is notoriously anti-Antony, full of accusations of all of Antony's wantonness, and drunkenness and sort of gluttony, every possible form of invective that you can imagine. In the meantime, Antony had decided that he was no longer going to try to fight for the hearts of the Roman people with Octavian. He had tried in various ways to cut off Octavian's ability to court the support of the Roman people. He had prevented the release of Caesar's estate so that Octavian was not able to give the 300 sesterces that each Roman had been promised. But Octavian does an end run. He sells his own property so that he can pay off that debt to the Roman people. And really, Antony realizes that it's probably a losing proposition to fight for the hearts and minds of the Romans, that he will let Octavian have that. So he leaves Rome to take command in Cisalpine Gaul. And this was Gaul on the nearer side of the Alps. It was a very important province. It was the passageway to Italy from the north. It was an extremely powerful command, and it was one that Antony was desperate to have. Unfortunately, the governor who was there at the time refused to leave. He wasn't going to give up that command, and we see here the extent to which authority and sort of republican regularity had really broken down. So Antony, in response to this governor refusing to leave, sets siege to the city of Mutina, where the governor has holed up. And the point of this siege is to force the governor to give up so that Antony can get his command. Well, Cicero sees an opportunity here, and he decides that one of the ways that he can exact his revenge on Antony is to throw his support behind Octavian. So, there'd been this quibbling between Octavian and Antony in the aftermath of Caesar's assassination, and now Cicero throws himself into the middle of it in a very deliberate way. And so in 43, Cicero goes to bat for Octavian with the Senate, and he persuades the Senate and the consuls to support Octavian and give him a kind of imperium, or authority command. It's an imperium that is subordinate to that of the consuls, but it allows, for instance, Octavian to now be treated as an ex-consul in the Senate, and he will now jump over the cursus honorum and become immediately one of the first people that will be consulted when any matter is deliberated in the Senate. This is a huge thing for somebody who's 18 years old. So, and this is all because of Cicero, and basically Cicero using Octavian as his pawn in the fight against Antony. And you have a bronze statue of the young Octavian on the left-hand side of your slide. So Octavian, with his army that he had raised personally, as well as the consular armies, go north to Mutina, and they liberate Mutina from Antony in 43. Unfortunately, in the fighting, both of the consuls are killed. Octavian survives, but both of the consuls are killed. Interestingly, though, Octavian decides that he's done. Antony has left town. He survived the fighting and took foot. Octavian does not pursue him. He refuses to pursue him, in fact. His view is, my job was to help liberate Mutina. I have done so. And part of this is that Octavian has his own plans, and it does not include being a pawn of Cicero or of the Roman Senate. So in the aftermath of Mutina, Antony has survived, he has fled, and he joins up with Lepidus. Lepidus, who was in charge of the Roman army. And Lepidus had been the Magister Equitum in the aftermath of Caesar's assassination, so he had had some substantial power even in March, but the two of them had not decided to join forces. They now decide to do this, and Lepidus officially renounces his loyalties to the Senate. So again, we see the extent to which, after Caesar's death, Rome was really on the verge of anarchy. And there's this power vacuum that several people are struggling to fill. And so we have this alliance now between Antony and Lepidus. They control a substantial number of troops, and they pose a serious threat to Rome. Octavian, in the meantime, who has refused to pursue Antony, has refused to obey the orders of the Senate, now demands, again, 18 years old, demands that he be elected consul. So, violating every rule that was in place to govern the cursus honorum. But Octavian doesn't care. The Senate, of course, refuses, and Octavian's response then is to march on Rome. So, in the model of his adopted father Caesar, as well as Sulla before him, Octavian opts to seize power. And he can do this because he controls a substantial number of troops. So he's got this whole army that is personally loyal to him rather than to Rome. Things are messy right now. The Senate realizes they don't have the power, that their authority rests purely in a kind of understood authority rather than in military might. And that between the forces of Antony and Lepidus, as well as Octavian, they don't stand a chance. So they name Octavian consul. And part of what Octavian then does as consul is declare that Caesar's assassins, Cassius and Brutus, as well as Sextus Pompey, the surviving son of Pompey, are going to be declared enemies of the state. And the Senate just has to go along with this. The Senate is the one that passes these SCUs, but they really can't resist. They can't oppose what Octavian is demanding because of the military force that Octavian commands. Then Octavian does something totally unpredictable, and something that Cicero in particular would come to regret, that he did not anticipate. Rather than fight on his own, Octavian recognizes he doesn't really stand a chance fighting against Antony and Lepidus right now, that he's not in a strong enough position of power. And so what he does is attempt a reconciliation with the two of them. He tries to create an alliance with the two of them. And this was entirely unpredictable. It's a very savvy move, but something that nobody saw coming, least of all Cicero. So here are some review questions. I'll let you go over these at your own pace. You can press pause, and when you're ready to resume the lecture, you can do so. So we have this reconciliation between Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus. And this then creates what is known as the Second Triumvirate in 43 BC. They form an alliance that has a 5-year term, and they make it legal. So they ensure through Octavian's consulship that a law is passed that makes this triumvirate, this alliance, legal. It has actual legal standing. And it's an important distinction between this triumvirate and that of the first triumvirate of Pompey, Caesar, and Crassus, which had no legal standing. There was never a law passed that gave them any kind of power that was directly connected to the alliance itself. Their power was always connected to whatever offices they held. And so here we have a complete distinction where now the second triumvirate, nobody needs to hold a consulship. It's the triumvirate itself that has legal power to act in passing laws and doing various other things. It also has a 5-year term that's put in place, where the first triumvirate was just sort of renewed when it seemed like it was necessary, and it broke apart when it was no longer viable for the partners. So among the powers that this second triumvirate had, perhaps most importantly, the authority to make laws, independent of the Senate and the Roman people. So they did not need to go through the normal process of enacting legislation where you proposed a law and then it was voted on either by the Senate or the tribal assembly, and that was required to enact legislation. Now this triumvirate can simply declare something a law. There's no appeals of their decision, so whatever they say goes. And they have the right to nominate all magistrates, so any office holder. So now we have, once again, a challenge to the usual system of elections that guided the cursus honorum. Now these members of the triumvirate can simply name people to hold office. It is important to note, though, that they didn't always exercise this power. There were elections that happened. It tended to be that for an important position, they used the right of nomination. When it didn't matter so much, they allowed an election to happen. And part of this was done to make it at least seem on the surface that there were still parts of the republic functioning, that they hadn't completely banished all aspects of republican government. They also divided up Roman territories amongst the 3 of them. So Antony took Gaul. This was an incredibly important province, and it was something that Antony was going to protect very carefully. Lepidus was given Spain, a slightly less important province, and Octavian took Africa, Sicily, and Sardinia. These were the grain-providing provinces, so important in that they were the breadbasket for Italy. And eventually, when Octavian successfully defeats Antony, Egypt will be annexed, and that will become a second breadbasket for Italy. But for now, Rome and all of Italy is dependent on importing grain from North Africa, Sicily, and Sardinia. The big priority, the agreed upon aim or first goal of this triumvirate was the punishment of Caesar's assassins. And we can see in that a very interesting moment where Octavian clearly is able to put his aims above those of Antony and Lepidus, and that they allow that to happen. Antony and Lepidus were not as interested in, it wasn't as politically useful for them to have Caesar's assassins punished. So the punishment of Caesar's assassins happens at the Battle of Philippi. This happens in 42 BC. It is preceded by the deification of Julius Caesar by the Senate. And this was the second part of Octavian's plan. He wants the assassins punished, and he wants his adopted father made a god. And of course, he then would benefit by being the son of a god. And, you know, don't think that Octavian did not repeatedly use that nomenclature to refer to himself. It's also probably at this time that the month of Julius Caesar's birth, Quintilis, was renamed Julius, and this is where we get July from. So it was actually not when he revised the calendar, but in the aftermath of his assassination, that this month gets renamed after him. Octavian and Antony eventually meet the forces of Brutus and Cassius in Macedonia. So once again, we have a war between Roman citizens being fought outside of Italy. And partly this was just that it made it seem less of a civil war. It did less damage to communities in Italy, and it meant that people weren't forced to pick sides in quite the same brutal fashion. And so after various kinds of troop movements and maneuverings, they eventually come face to face in Macedonia on the plains of Philippi. And it's during this battle that we have a couple of face-to-face battles fought over a period of about 3 weeks. It's no easy victory for the forces of Octavian and Antony. And in particular, the forces of Octavian were in fact defeated by Brutus and his army. But eventually they are successful, and Brutus and Cassius separately are forced to either be taken captive or commit suicide. And here we have an image, and you can see it's not entirely clear, but if you look carefully at the hand, this is of Brutus, the hand guiding the sword into his breast in this standard move of political suicide. So refusing to be taken captive, refusing to be paraded in a triumph, he kills himself. This victory at Philippi, which was, as I said, no easy victory at all, and your textbook describes some of the complications, was owed largely to the military prowess of Antony. Octavian didn't really do very well. And it's clear that although Octavian was very good at getting people to fight for him, that he was not a natural military commander. Antony was much more experienced and much better at it. And had it not been for Antony, it's very likely that the assassins would have escaped, and even that Octavian would have been killed. And one thinks that Octavian probably knew this when he initiated the Second Triumvirate at its formation the year before. So with the suicides of Brutus and Cassius, we have really the end of the Republic, and they become symbols of the end of the Roman Republic. If the death of the rape and the suicide of Lucretia is symbolic of the beginning of the Republic, there is another pair of suicides at the end that are symbolic of its end. And supposedly, as he was dying, Brutus mutters out or calls out, "Oh, wretched virtue, you were but a name, and yet I worshipped you as real indeed, but now it seems you are only fortune's slave." So again, highlighting the extent to which he saw himself as fighting for these important Roman values, liberty, virtue, and that in the end it's fortune that is his undoing. Augustus talks about, and Augustus is Octavian, as we'll talk about in a bit. Octavian eventually changes his name, but when Octavian/Augustus writes about the Battle of Philippi in his memoirs, the Res Gestae, he remembers it in slightly different terms and says, "I sent into exile the murderers of my father." Well, he didn't really, but he takes credit for it. "Punishing their crimes with regular tribunals." So, in other words, trying to say that there was a legal process, that he didn't just murder them. "And afterwards, when they made war on the Republic, I twice defeated them in battle." So a kind of reimagination of what happened at Philippi. In fact, he and Antony went after the forces of Brutus and Cassius. They were the aggressors, but now he rewrites it that, in fact, Brutus and Cassius were the ones who were making war on the Republic, and that he was simply defending the Republic. And interestingly, is still referring to it as the Republic. And we'll talk a little bit about whether that is a fair assessment. So after Philippi, Brutus and Cassius are dead. It's very clear now that Caesar, this triumvirate, is ruling Rome. We have another three-headed monster ruling Rome. Antony, who had been the power that was responsible for the victory at Philippi, is given the better assignment of staying in the east, settling the veterans, collecting money to pay the veterans, and so forth. Octavian, on the other hand, returns to Italy with other veterans that he also needs to settle. It's a less desirable assignment and is reflective in some ways of the fact that at this moment, Antony has more power. Octavian needs Antony more than Antony needs Octavian. So one of the problems that faced Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus is the issue of paying the troops. So they were able to levy a substantial number of troops and already had several already in their control in 43 when the Second Triumvirate was formed. The problem was they had no way of paying them. And so they resort to an old tactic that Sulla had used, but that Caesar had not used, and Caesar had deliberately not used. And this tactic was land confiscations and proscriptions. This was what sort of sent the fear of God running up and down the spines of Romans. They were absolutely terrified that these military forces, these men with standing armies, would come in and take their land away. Sulla had done it, and that fear had stayed with people, and it's partly why Caesar did not do it. But now Antony and Octavian really have no other choice. It's the only way that they're going to be able to have enough land to settle their large number of veterans and also raise the funds to pay them. So as part of the proscriptions that were carried out in 43, they add Cicero to the list, and he's added by Antony. Remember that Cicero had very directly opposed Antony in the period leading up to Mutina, to that siege at Mutina. It's Cicero that persuades the Senate to support Octavian against Antony. So the riot, or the hatred, the antagonism between the two was firmly solidified. It had already started in the aftermath of Caesar's death, when Cicero had given these speeches, the Philippics. It became much, much worse in the days leading up to Mutina, and by 43, it was absolutely solidified. So Antony says, well, here's my excuse to get rid of Cicero. And Cicero, I think, thought that he was safe. He thought that Octavian, whom he had supported, would protect him. Well, it turns out Octavian doesn't. Octavian decides that Cicero is expendable. And so on the 7th of December, 43, Pearl Harbor Day, as it would eventually happen, but the 7th of December, 43, Cicero is killed. He has his head chopped off. And it's a sign of Cicero's extraordinary miscalculations. Throughout his life, Cicero was always choosing the wrong side. And with Caesar, he got off. When he chose Pompey's side in the civil war against Caesar at Pharsalus, Caesar forgave him. Caesar gave him clemency or clemency and let him escape. But Cicero was always sticking his nose into things and not knowing which side to choose. So he was enormously successful politically in getting himself to the position of consul. But he seemed to lack a kind of savvy that allowed him to pick the right side of these constantly shifting alliances, and eventually it would lead to his death. And here you have a medieval manuscript with an illumination showing an imagination of Cicero's murder. So sort of the guy holding the sword and Cicero on his knees about to get his head cut off. We're told that Cicero's head and hands were taken from where he was killed in a villa in Italy, were taken back to Rome, were displayed on the rostra by Antony's order. And the point here was, Antony saying to Romans, don't speak against me and don't write against me. And his tongue was cut out of his head. And so this notion there that, this very vivid reminder to Romans that if you go against me, there will be a price to pay. And there were Cicero's hands and his head for all to see. So here are some review questions. I'll let you go over these at your own pace. And when you're done with these, you're done with the lecture.